Hello and a very warm welcome to In These Times. We're here to talk about mental health problems and how they affect your life. So I hope you're going to join me on the podcast and the YouTube channels in the weeks to come. We want to tackle the distress these issues can cause with the help of experts who regularly make a difference in people's lives, particularly those who work in the field of the talking therapies. But these programmes are very much about giving hope, and you'll hear from some of my guests who have walked through those dark places of the mind, but come out the other side. The mind is a strange and mysterious place to most of us, isn't it? But we've all got one, and sometimes we need help with the pain that it throws up. And that's certainly been the case for far too many people during the pandemic. So to do our best for you, we need your help. Your participation is vital for this project. Please could you use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know exactly what you'd like discussed in future programmes. Your involvement will shape our broadcast content and help you. Our website is ITTMind.com. Help us to help you. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you to the co-founder of In These Times, Previn Carrion. And Previn is a psychotherapist and change management consultant. In 2016, he edited a book on gender and sexual diversity with 15 authors from the US, the UK, Canada, Russia and India, called Critical and Experiential. It's available from the website rzpub.com. He's currently working on a book about the psychology of democracy in Carl Jung. As a business consultant, he specialises in brand management, coaching, team building and infrastructure process efficiencies. So with me now is Previn, and the first thing to ask you, and to welcome you of course.
Thank you, Chrissie.
I'd like us both perhaps to say why we decided to start In These Times. It's really important people know why it matters.
Yes, that's a great question. Why does it matter? I think our history goes back to 2008 when on your website there are clips of the radio broadcast that we actually did on mental health for, I think it was a year and a half. And during that time, what we were able to achieve was a form of therapeutic and psychological information for the public, essentially free of charge. And that had to come to a stop because I had an office in Portsmouth. My client workload increased, and so we had to put that on the shelf. But ever since then, I think it's been your passion to bring this kind of knowledge to the public. And I wonder if you could say some more about that and why you feel so passionately about bringing psychological help to the public.
Well, I really do feel passionate about it because I see so many people who are in distress. I think my interest started because I'm a journalist and broadcaster, so I've come across all sorts of people in all sorts of predicaments and all sorts of pain. And very gradually it kind of began to hit me that something ought to be done about this, and were people doing anything to help themselves? I think also what was one of the points was that I, for quite a long period of my life, was on an independent monitoring board of a prison. So I had access to files of prisoners, which led me to be able to look at what had come before they landed up in prison. In other words, their childhoods and all this. And it really, really alarmed me that people had been through such abuse, such trauma, such terrible trouble. Was it surprising they were in prison? So that really fired me up. And then, of course, of more recent times along came COVID. And again, a lot through broadcasting, I've realised the amount of pain, it isn't just people getting sick physically, it's what's gone with it and what the lockdowns have done to people, the isolation, the loneliness, the real fear, and how it's all compiled into a real problem, an amalgam of mental health distress. And I do feel we want to look at some of those particular things during this series, the effect of bereavement and all those, and anxiety and depression, and to see if we can really do something about it.
Yes, and I think there are many important linked political questions which really are about not the left or the right. It's not about Labour or Tory. It's about government policy. And government policy for decades and decades has tried to look as if it was addressing mental health and never did. So I think mental health raises a political issue in a very, very different way that isn't about appealing to one party or another. It is about the British public. It is about the general public and their right to be looked after in mental health. And it's just not enough to wheel out one MP who happens to champion a cause and makes a headline in the Telegraph or the Mirror every now and then. That does not equate to mental health policy. And what both parties need to address is this huge gap that there is simply a vacuum when it comes to mental health.
And people are very frightened because they might go to their GP if they're lucky enough to actually see one these days, and they might get fed some medication. But the fact is, I realise there's so much now that to get better, for them to get over their problems, it takes time and a great deal of tender loving care from people who might administer that. But there just aren't enough treatments about.
Yes, the issue of treatment is again, unfortunately, a political issue. Treatments have generally been very medicalised, and that is understandable. Governments have literally tried to contain the mass problem of mental health. And because drugs contain behaviours, they suppress your nervous system, they help you get through very dark times. The go-to solution for mental health has always been medication. And that has been effective for numerous people. That cannot be denied. And as a government policy, it has helped to contain mental health. But there's a huge problem with mental health that isn't addressed in medicalised answers or treatments. And this is the problem of the human mind. And if there are two things that society hates to talk about, one is the human mind, that we all have a mind of our own. And that's rarely discussed for a whole number of reasons. And the other really serious problem in mental health is we have feelings. And emotions and feelings are anathema to society today. Nobody wants to admit they have them. Nobody wants to talk about them. And other than the commercialised versions of feelings in films and romantic films and so on, feelings are simply not allowed. Now that's dangerous because it builds up and accumulates into a crisis in individuals. And when there are too many individuals nationally, we then have a serious problem with mental health across the nation.
So it's a sort of mass denial, is it?
Yes, it's a mass resistance to look at our own minds and our own feelings. So governments play along with that because the governmental agenda over the years has been one thing only, and that is the economy. And unfortunately, money does not make the true wealth of a nation. If you have a nation of sick people who are mentally disordered or pathologically disordered, you have nothing in this nation other than a really serious bankruptcy.
Well, we'll come to how you know you need help in a minute, but I think it's quite important to have a look at what is available at the moment. So somebody's watching this, they need help. The word on the street is that the NHS just aren't cutting it.
Yes, that's harsh but true. The NHS were never set up to deal with mental health. If you think about the origins of the NHS, after the World War I, the Labour Party with Nye Bevan, who set it up, he set it up as a medicalised response to anybody in the British public, regardless of class, race, creed or colour. It was simply to serve the British people. And at that time, because there was a sense of what the British people meant after the war, people cooperated. But the NHS was always founded on medical answers. Now, if you suddenly ask the NHS to find answers to mental health, it simply isn't geared to do it. It's rather like asking the fire service to set up an A&E department because there happens to be a fire, when all they do is put out the fire at Grenfell. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the skill sets, they don't have the training or the mentality to know what to do with A&E. For that, you need a different kind of training and a different kind of investment. The entire structure has to be different for mental health.
Well, later on in the series, we're going to hear from a very eminent psychotherapist, Andrew Samuels, who is going to be damning about cognitive behavioural therapy, which I'm sure you'll come to in a second, because that's what's on offer through the NHS. In fact, I know people watching will want to know the different sorts of therapies, but I was wondering, really, what the general areas, people get very confused between counselling and therapy, and they certainly get confused about whether they can afford it. But let's look at what each can deal with.
Yeah, so if we start with cognitive behavioural therapy and its unfortunate rollout in the NHS, which perhaps we can discuss at another time because that is a huge field. But CBT was designed on the basis that it controlled behaviours. So the whole assumption behind cognition and cognitive behavioural therapy was that you can think your way out of a problem. So if you have depression, you can think your way out of it. You simply need to understand why you have negative thinking. And so that was the way it was rolled out. Now, CBT is far deeper than that for those who are fully trained. They're very well aware that there's a lot more to it than just slapping people around the heads, getting them to write diaries and journals, think positive thoughts, and use their cognition. But CBT was purely to contain and control people in crisis and to give them some kind of handle on extreme emotion.
Right. And so who would that be suitable for today?
I'm almost tempted to say virtually no one, but the problem is that mental health has escalated so much, it's become overwhelming for so many people, that CBT has sadly become quite an ineffective tool. It's not really cutting it because the intensity of what people are going through in mental health, their mental health suffering is just far too much for cognition alone to be able to deal with it.
Well, we have to say now, and we will do more on this later, but, CBT is free on the NHS, but we've heard very, very well-to-do, knowledgeable people say that it's pretty naff. Anyway, we need to look at some of the actual classifications of illness, really, of mental health illness, because it's interesting for people to feel, do they fall into one of these brackets? So we have anxiety and depression, bereavement, addictions. We have relationship breakdowns, eating disorders, so many.
Yes, there are many, many classifications of mental health. And in fairness now to the psychiatric professions, they are helpful in giving people some kind of handle on what is going on. Psychiatric classifications and the diagnosis that they put out that are available on the internet and available particularly in a publication called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, it does help people ask the question, what is my prevalent and dominant disorder? What is the thing I feel the most is dysfunctional? And if people can get that kind of classification, that I'm more anxious than depressed, or that it's gone beyond anxiety into an eating disorder, so I've now become obsessional and panicky, people can at least identify where they are on the mental health spectrum and then try to find some answers in response to what they feel.
So who is going to do that for them? Their GP, a psychiatrist, or a psychotherapist, or who?
Usually it would be a GP who then refers you to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So we can now look at those two distinctions. Psychologists work on questionnaires that ask you to self-report on how you feel about yourself. So psychologists have at their disposal huge numbers of classifications that they can help you with. They can help you understand not just where the dominant trouble is in your mind, but the severity of it. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if you're a 5, 7 or 9, psychologists with a questionnaire can help you get that measured out a little bit more. And that's the work of psychology, but they generally don't do much more than that because they're not trained to do more than that. To get the answers then, once you have your classification, you can then go to a psychiatrist who can then give you an appropriate medication based on the severity of your condition and the classification. So anxiety has a totally different set of drugs to depression.
Are they going to get that for free?
On the NHS, yes, but you have to ask for the referrals through your GP, and your GP should then be able to refer you to a psychiatrist or a specialist unit.
Now, another one that really confuses, I think, many of us is the difference between counselling and therapy.
Yes, so counselling is very much about staying in the present and dealing with the present crisis. Now, when I mention the word crisis, you have crisis counsellors. A lot of counsellors are specifically trained and very skillfully trained to deal with very specific crises that you may be going through. For example, domestic abuse, for example, suicidal ideation, for example, eating disorders, rape lines. These are all very specialist areas, and counsellors are trained to deal with your problem in the present. They don't look at your past, they don't look at anything psychological. They simply come to your aid and help you get out of where you are. So that's crisis counselling. Other counselling that is available on a one-to-one basis is still about the present, and it helps you ground yourself. Ask yourself, what are you actually feeling right now? And find a language for your emotions. Because again, people don't talk about feelings and they don't talk about their mind. Now, thoughts are racing in our minds. Feelings are rampant and overwhelming. And yet when you talk to people who are suffering, they can't tell you what they're feeling. They can't tell you what they're thinking. They just don't know. So the counselling is all about helping you to get that first step of psychological contact, and that you understand you have a mind, your emotions have a language, and with the help of somebody else, you can actually speak.
Right, so you're going to get that for free on the NHS?
No, unfortunately not. And for that, you have to start looking on the internet and start to find counsellors who are available, who can help you with a current crisis. Remember, this is not therapy. It's not psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. But counsellors can help you. And it doesn't necessarily take years and years of counselling to help you shift into a language of emotion and recognising you have a mind of your own.
Just to remind you that this is In These Times with me, Chrissie Pollard. A reminder that we have based this project on your participation. So please use the Contact Us button to tell us what you'd like discussed in future programmes. And please also use the Donate button to help us make more programmes for you. Our website again is ITTMind.com. Help us to help you. So let's just look at someone who's had, I was talking about the prisoners in the prison, years and years and years of a build-up of real problems in their life, of trauma, of distress, and it has led to crime. So people who have had that long, they should not be heading for counselling, presumably. They should be heading for a therapist.
Yes, so psychotherapy and psychoanalysis are very different to counselling. Now, there are, of course, overlaps, because a psychoanalyst, a good psychoanalyst, in my opinion, or a good psychotherapist, does need to have counselling skills. And good counsellors will usually want to start looking at psychoanalytic treatments and psychotherapeutic treatments. But therapy is a completely different thing, because therapy directly addresses your mind. It assumes you have a mind. There are models that your therapist will work with, and they are trying to help you unpack the structural problem that is sitting inside your mind and that drives you to depression, to anxiety, to eating disorders.
So that could take 6 months, 10 years, who knows?
It's not 6 months. If you really are very dysfunctional and you're very overwhelmed, you cannot expect your mind to find his or herself in 6 months. So you have to be prepared for the long journey, which is about how much do I want to know the truth about myself? And it's very painful work, because you're going back to the origins of your structure in the mind, the origins of depression, the origins of anxiety. And these are very painful questions that you will end up asking about your family of origin, about your schooling years, about your relationships with brothers and sisters, and your first attempts to go into the world, into the social world of work or further education.
I mean, the horror story for all this, I've discovered, is the cost to all this. While the NHS stick rigidly to their cognitive behavioural therapy, which is probably no good for anybody, but, you know, we're open to debate in these times. If anybody wants to contradict me, that's fine too. But we live in the real world, and therapy is said to work for many people. It can transform lives, but it costs.
There's no way out of this. therapy does cost because you are paying the counsellor or the therapist to get the training, to pay back their enormous course fees to qualify, and their continued professional development. They have to subsist. And if you don't pay your therapist, they simply will not be there. So there is a resentment, though, and a very understandable resentment. Why should I have to pay somebody to look at my life and my mind when perhaps a drink with a mate at the pub could do it? But the drink in the pub can't do it. The bottle of wine doesn't console you. And there comes a point when you have to have a more technical frame that helps you unlock and unpack that. So if you want your car to be fixed, you pay a cost. And sometimes the MOT bill is horrendous, but you pay it because you know that's important to you. Now, if the mind is like a vehicle that needs to be maintained and has gone badly wrong, you do need to calm down with that rage and expect to pay for it, because it's your mind, it's your life that we're talking about, and that's priceless.
Well, I think I feel fairly outraged the fact that the NHS doesn't offer any of this stuff, and I'm sure a lot of people watching this do. I mean, it is quite wrong that they don't understand the benefits of psychotherapy. They just stick rigidly to their plan, which I'm told was all about cognitive behavioural therapy getting people back to work so the economy benefited, which is monstrous.
It may be monstrous, Chrissie, but the point is that this trajectory has been growing since the Industrial Revolution and has been predicted. And what has been predicted is that money is the only value in society. Human life has none. Now, that's a very stark comment to make, but that is the trajectory of society we live in today. The only value is money. So when it comes to economics, governments play around with money. They make decisions based on money. They make decisions based on people who have money. And there hasn't been enough of an economic crisis that has halted the government, like COVID, and made the governments think, oh dear, we do need a population with citizens with good mental health. That's never happened yet. It will do.
Well, along my sort of general feeling of this is all wrong is the whole business of children. And I mean, it is shocking the amount of our children who are getting sick since COVID. And the word is that they spent too long on their social media sites and so on. But the fact is, whatever it is, it has led to eating disorders, just alarming figures of young people who've got them, of depression, they've lost their way, they're isolated, they're locked away in families that may not be treating them too well. And the whole thing is a tsunami of children illness.
Well, this gets to the heart of a fundamental change in the British landscape and in the British psyche. You see, after World War II, there was a great sense of caring for the British public, and particularly children were seen as the future of the country. So any investments in them, for example, free education, which was again another Labour Party policy at the time, was a clear recognition that we need to care for the nation and we need to care for our future, and therefore we need to care for children. Now, with this drive with austerity, with the drives in economic policy for more and more cash, which happens, by the way, to be going to fewer and fewer people and more people being driven into poverty, that tipping point has yet to actually escalate into a crisis. But until then, what we're getting is children are simply not important. So the governments don't care about children. It's a shocking change in the British landscape. But that has what has happened to Britain today.
Well, it truly is shocking. We've got children waiting at the Children and Adolescent Mental Health Services, CAMS, years and years and years, and they're killing themselves by not eating or harming themselves. I mean, what kind of society are we?
We're a society that doesn't understand or want to look at the mind. We are a society that is petrified of looking at feelings. And sadly, based on what you've just asking, we are also a society that no longer has the time or energy to look at children. We are back to Victorian times. They are to be seen and not heard. And that's all that children do. So even their suffering is seen, but not heard. It's a fact. Children are neglected, their mental health is neglected, yet they are the future wealth, the true wealth of the nation.
Yes, And I know most psychotherapists would have a look at the first 6 or 7 years of their life because it starts so young. I mean, I'm quite impressed that the Duchess of Cambridge, she hasn't got a lot of coverage, but she's saying, let's have a look at the first 6 or 7 years because they matter.
They always have, but if you look at child poverty, if you look at Marcus Rashford's attempts to just get children fed, that tells you where Britain is today, okay? And that's not the whole of the country, because clearly there are a lot of people who do support Marcus Rashford. There are a lot of people in Britain who do care about children, but they're not the dominant majority. Something has shifted in the political landscape, and that has impacted on mental health. It just isn't important. The only value is money, human life has none, and the human mind has even less value. Children, unfortunately, are suffering terribly, and it is an urgent issue that will only rear its head in the future.
You see, I'm tempted to say people are quite prepared to go and glue themselves to the M25 for a good cause, or Black Lives Matter. Admirable causes, wonderful causes, but so's this.
But this is a different thing, because if you take an individual and ask an individual, please would you look at your own mind and face your own demons, face your own pain, think about the emotional distress that you carry with you all the time. That's a big ask, because we don't have a language anymore to do that. We have a psychologically impoverished society that doesn't know how to talk about these things. So to get the equivalent of a BLM movement for mental health, or an Extinction Rebellion movement for mental health, is very, very difficult, because mental suffering happens to individuals. It doesn't happen to groups.
You see, we've changed so dramatically. The gay lobby, terrific. You know, a lot of lobbies have been very, very successful, but there's still this huge stigma sitting over people with mental health, which seems to me crazy, because we're talking about the future of people's lives.
But mental health has never been understood as the wealth of a nation. If you go back to John Ruskin, who actually came up with that phrase, the true wealth of a nation is its people, Ruskin was talking about art and the importance of art in society. Okay, so if you even think about something as simple as art is no longer valued, culture is no longer valued, money is drained away from these places because it's seen to not produce things. But what these things produce, along with mental health, is healthy, functioning, emotionally mature citizens. And governments are not interested in emotionally mature citizens who have a mind of their own. There's a political reason for that.
Where's the stigma come from on mental health?
The stigma has come from society, but it's also come from years and years. So I wouldn't want to blame or scapegoat our society in particular. You know, this happens in countries all across the world. If you think about what's happening in mental health in Russia, you know, what's happening with mental health in China, Brazil, these places, India, Africa, there isn't any continent or nation that is at ease with mental health. Now, historically, when people have mental health issues, they are treated as the village idiot. They're treated as somebody who's ill. They're outcasts from society because they're not functioning. It was only with the advent of the caring society that cared for its weakest members as a mark of its civilization, only at that point did mental health start becoming important. And if you even look at the history of asylums and how that's evolved from literally just throwing them out of sight in appalling conditions to the kinds of interventions and treatments that we can give people now, you can see that mental health has had a huge journey to go as a problem of civilization. So stigma has always been in society. Society has not wanted to look at itself and the human mind because it is terrifying when you go there.
I know people will be watching this all over the world, and I was interested to see that places like China haven't got off after COVID. Their levels of depression are high. So India, the US, of course, and ourselves. But most countries have suffered, and their governments have been very, very slow to react to treatment. Switzerland have been rather good about it, but they're rather a lone voice in all this. So Previn, somebody comes to you, because this is what this is going to be about in these times, and says, I don't have much money, but I know I'm not well. I'm depressed all the time. I don't know where I'm going. My children are unhappy. What can we do about it?
It's a very difficult situation, and it's a very sad response that I'll have to give to that kind of question. Because people do need to pay and therapists do need to live. I think one of the outrageous issues is that people can't even get mental health on insurance, so that they had some kind of cover for these issues. But then, of course, the insurance companies may not do very well out of that economically because they'd have to pay out so much. What people need to get a grip on is your mental health is going to be your responsibility. No one will care for you. There are no answers out there. There is no caring institution, no caring government out there. You have to get to grips with this and start taking your issues on by yourself. And that's a very lonely place to be. It's a very hard place to be when you're already feeling quite collapsed and overwhelmed. But that is the only thing you can start to do. Now, once you start to do that, you then unfortunately have to go to this incredible place called the internet. And you have to start getting answers on YouTube. You can also get books on psychology, moving from pop psychology, self-help books, through to more technical books. Get on seminars that are run by training institutions for psychotherapists. See if they have open days and get a feel for what it's like to have a mind of your own. Get a feel for what it's like to have feelings.
We're going to deal with lots of the things that you may be suffering from out there, or your family or friends. You may be able to just identify from what we're going to do in the future, the next weeks, what does affect you. I think it's terribly important that people feel able to spend some money on this. Now, the thing is, we will all go to the pub and buy rounds. A lot of us will pop down to the acupuncturist or the herbalist if we're feeling a bit under the weather. But do we really think some sessions in therapy is as good an investment?
Well, you've talked about the word investment, and that's critical. You don't really invest in acupuncture. You don't really have to invest in herbal treatments or a yoga class or a hot sauna to relax you. Those are not investments. They're temporary alleviations to keep your mental health in some kind of balance. Unfortunately, when you have a mental health issue, that has pushed you into another level. And so the issue of cost, the issue of confrontation of your mind, confrontation of your dysfunction, confrontation of all the things that distress you so deeply has to be your choice.
Yes, and we cannot sit here and say that it won't be painful.
Indeed, because what happens is that people with mental health issues are already suffering. Now, if someone has a broken leg or a punctured lung or is dying of cancer, that's very visible. The danger and difficulty with mental health is that it's invisible. So it's very hard to believe, to begin with, that somebody does have mental health issues.
It's very difficult, and it's very hard for an individual to say honestly to themselves, I'm drinking too much, I've stopped eating normally and I'm losing weight, I might have something wrong with me eating-wise, or, I've been very violent for a long period of time or aggressive to a lot of people and it's lost me several jobs. They're all kind of human predicaments that we have to address, and we have to be honest with ourselves and say, can we do something about these?
Yes, you see, but society tells you not to think about these things. Society tells you to stop imagining that you have a problem with mental health, and it continuously condones dysfunctional behaviour, distressful behaviour, as long as you economically function. So as long as you can get the cash for your company, your boss, as long as you can buy the bigger house, the cost to you personally and to those you love is of no consequence. And unfortunately, we live in a society where it takes a breakdown, it takes the crisis before an individual is actually going to confront themselves and say, I have to do something about it. It's technically called a state of denial. We deny that we have problems, but denial is a very specific mechanism. It is a way of lying to yourself that there is a problem.
Yeah, and I think people who've been through the pandemic and all it brought, there's a feeling that we know it. Perhaps it's passing, who knows, but maybe we should be getting better. We ought to be able to cope with this. And of course, life's not like that, is it? We're not like that as people.
No, we're not. We are human beings, but this is, of course, a social problem that human beings are no longer recognised. And even when they are, for example, minority groups who start to form groups, they also become some kind of organisation that starts fighting for itself. And even in those organisations, it's very easy for the individual to lose his or herself or themselves. So it is a problem that there's this constant pressure on groups and organisations to perform some kind of action, it's called performative action, in which the individual is lost. And unfortunately, in every situation that happens, mental health will kick off.
So you and I have started in these times, and we want to speak for people's minds. We want to give them hope and opportunities to find a way through all this. That's my stance on it. What's yours?
Yes, I think I'm going back very much to 2008 when we first kicked off the work. And I think the work we did back then was very valuable. I think what has happened, as you pointed out, is since the pandemic, when you first called me and said, we've got to do something about this, I understood that it's not really an option anymore. It is something that needs to be done. So from my point of view, it's about getting as much free information as we can out there. From my point of view, it's about getting mental health experts to come out of their one-to-one little rooms and start sharing some of their information with the general public. And I think it's also something about academics and professionals in the field to step out of where they are and understand that there is a massive public agenda. And maybe we're not going to block motorways, but we do need to get into the public forum on the internet and start saying and doing something for free.
Yeah, I think we need to make a lot of fuss, and I propose to do so. But we're going to be here for a while, lots of weeks, bringing you lots of ideas. And we want good stories too. We want to hear from you about what you have in mind for yourselves, and maybe success stories as well, people that have been through therapy and had something to come from it. So I hope very much that you will get in touch with us, and we will be telling you how to do so on our Contact Us button in a minute. But thank you so much, Previn, for being with me.
You're welcome.
Please remember that in these times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. So please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. And please also make a donation so that we can go on bringing you these broadcasts as long as possible. Our website again is ITTMind.com. Help us to help you.